Hello, Ryerson Artspace. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Eve Tagny. I'm a Montreal, Tiohtià-based visual artist. I would say my practice is mostly lens-based and includes elements of installation and a little bit of performance. To mostly, in the last years, look at processes of bereavement and renewal and resilience that can be found in the rhythms and materials of spaces of nature. I'm also doing a little bit of writing, and I'm interested in relationships of intimacies and seeing how culturally hybrid communities kind of find creative ways of developing resilience and joy for life and resistance to various forms of oppression. I would say that I gradually and organically transitioned from a background in filmmaking and journalism into more of a visual arts practice and doing projects in the context of exhibitions that are happening in gallery spaces. There's two things that influenced or determined the path that I took from starting from image-based work into one that is more installative. I think one aspect is a certain limitation I found with fixed 2D images, whether it's photo or even video, the flatness of it. I think I felt frustrated with the limitations of what I was able to achieve with it. And myself as like a image maker, how great I was able to have images, that can kind of capture everything. And I think I went more towards actually following the route that I had with filmmaking of layering things, of, having image and adding sound and texture and voice and light and kind of going that way instead. But in space, having opportunities to kind of take up spaces and think about how can these images or fixed memories kind of become alive in three-dimensional spaces. So it kind of happened organically, and I'm still learning on the go. And I remember my first installs having actually no idea how to install something. And now I pay more attention when I visit, spaces and look at how things are hung and different ways of being with work in an environment. And the second thing was the themes themselves. When I started having opportunities to do exhibitions, I was really concerned with themes of grief, as I mentioned, and renewal and nature. And so it was important for me to integrate nature in the space itself and its materials, and to really capture the tension in time that exists in grief. And so starting to work with, materials like plastic, that have this kind of fake time or problematic time because they won't return to nature, they won't, decompose. And then having things like plants or soil or even stones, which have like their own timeline. And what happens when you have an image, which is this intention to fix time, and you bring it in conjunction with an organic material that has its own cycle, and how can then we review those images as something that we can re-enter and then can shift again and then can be revisited and altered. And so, I think it was important for me that if you think of grief and mourning and passing, this need to materialize what is invisible, to create spaces that felt a little bit like sanctuaries or holistic, and spaces that were gardens, basically, where all these stages of transformation of life happen at the same time, decay, and they all coexist. And so you can start to view mourning and passing and disappearance and death as part of one same cycle. So that's kind of how I started to dabble with installation. I was lucky enough to be in a moment where I felt very free to explore these things and have contexts also that allowed for trial and error and allowed for experimentation. Often we think of okay, I have this exhibition, it needs to be final and proper and resolved. And I think it's great when you show in spaces that are like, it's okay to present things that are unresolved. So yeah, I think all these things came together, and that's how I developed that language that I now use. It's really difficult to transition from the structure and context of university or school context and then into like the real world in a sense. I found personally that the hardest thing is access, I think, and the fact that all of a sudden you have to pay more for everything that you want to try out. So that transition is not easy, and I think it's important to think of, rather than rushing to find a studio, absolutely, because it's what you're supposed to do. Think about, what are your immediate needs? Maybe you need to take a break and do something different and have kind of a bit of a pullback and perspective period. I think it's good to evaluate, what is the most needed or affordable or urgent thing right now. But the most important thing, in my sense, is to kind of recreate a sense of community, or like have people that you can exchange ideas with. And that's something I miss from school, having like peers that are also trying things out next to you and being able to go back and forth. And, if you're able to share studio space with people that you know, or like either friends or people whose practice, you have correspondence with, that's really great. And then if you're able to do that also digitally, to set up kind of talks or just conversations with people that might live elsewhere, that's also a really good way, I find, to have your work progress. I would say focus on finding people after school. That's the most important thing, and people that you can share tools with. If somebody has a printer, why not share it? Because obviously access is also one of the main elements to think about when you get out in the real world. Imposter syndrome is definitely real. I think it affects certain people more than others. But it's also interesting to think that it's not really based on reality. It's not really based on actual achievement. I find that, that sense of security you have to find elsewhere, or kind of you have to counter the ways that we're used to value ourselves, and when you're doing art, you're always vulnerable in a sense, because you always have to be in correspondence with other people. It makes you feel like you're always either in transactional relationships, or they don't feel transactional, but they still feel like they hold elements of like judgment, or being judged or being seen. And that, I think, can be really difficult, and it can be difficult to maintain a sense of value, and maintain a sense that you have a right to even do what you do and express yourself, and that you're valid. And so yeah, it's tricky to kind of keep faith in yourself, in a sense, or keep faith that in your intentions in making. I think that's the most helpful thing for me. I think it's just important to not fall into those pitfalls of, kind of, we're doing art in systems that are still capitalist, and that wants to pit us against each other and compete for space, compete for attention, compete for prizes and grants and money. And putting aside the idea of competition is really vital. But it's true that, even if I'm in my first years of practice, I'm still, I've done the kind of freelance low paying or no paying at all, because it's for exposure thing for, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And when you're in it, it feels precarious and difficult and stressful and uncertain. If I think back of when I was in school, the work I was able to do felt frustrating in a sense because I wasn't really grounded in myself and in my experiences and who I was. And hopefully, in 10 years on, I'll look back at this time and think I wasn't that grounded. But it feels like I have a lot more language and knowledge to a certain values that I have, or values in terms of content of what I put out, but also in terms of how I want to work, or what kind of relationships I want to build. And conversations I think are important, and actions. So I do really value time, and I think taking the time to think things through, to do research, to experience other things as well, and not do art and maybe just kind of travel and just look at things, and not think that you need to gather elements or be making something or be productive all the time. And yeah, I think again the seasons have helped me with that. There's moments where you feel like you should do things, but then I remember that this period of winter, and the period of winter is really helpful as well, and is necessary. That moment of kind of slowness and stillness. So when I have periods like that, I try to welcome them and know that they're there for a reason. You sow things and you reap later. It's been really good to finally be able to open the group show that I'm part of, that's currently shown at the Museum of Contemporain in Montreal, titled La machine qui enseignait des arts aux oiseaux. It shows 34, I think, local artists, and it's been such a wild ride. I was just about to start production when the first lockdown happened. Things started to get pushed back as we were globally just learning how to cope with this and what it was. And luckily with summer, things picked up again after a period of me just feeling completely paralyzed. And yeah, I started working on the project again, and what has really carried me, I think, throughout it is one of the performances we were rehearsing for with visual artist and performer Florencia Sosare and Elisabeth d'Orléans. And we met kind of weekly or bi-weekly, and that really kind of rhythmed the work I was doing and allowed me to, I would say, stay focused on, again, my intentions and my own language, I would say. Obviously, it was my first experience showing in a museum, and so working also with this type of bigger institution, and that was my way of not letting external stress or noise influence the work, and really not try to think about who's going to see it. Do I need to translate certain things because maybe I'll have access to a different public? I think it was really important to stay focused and grounded, and also, what was I able to do within a context of, a global pandemic. And yeah, unfortunately, the second lockdown happened while we were installing the show back in September, and the museum decided to keep going and keep installing it, so whenever we would reopen, it would be up and ready to go and for the public. So it's been really interesting to finally be able to do that months later and start having the conversations that are within the work only now. I try to do things that are open for everybody, but obviously I always have, mostly Black people in mind, and I do it from the perspective of, someone who's racialized and who has inherited multiple cultural heritages. And obviously it's always part of what I do. And, especially this body of work looks at gestures of ritualized gestures of care and nurturing that we can enact in order to kind of free ourselves from, inherited trauma or violence or structures of oppression, and how can we carry out those gestures and rituals and intentions individually and collectively in conjunction with our environment and with nature, to kind of developed relationships that are more centered around care and nurturing, and being kind of stewards of our environment rather than having relationships of extraction and transaction, and hopefully develop more sustainable futures. And at the center of this intention for me is kind of, Black communities and African diaspora, which is, what I'm part of. Obviously, installing in the museum, it's kind of what happens to those gestures once they enter a space that doesn't necessarily has a long history of representing the Canadians that are from the diaspora, or what we call the diversity, which I hate, but doesn't necessarily have a lot of Black Canadian or Quebecois artists in its collection. And it's been exciting to do that, to be part of that show, because I think it's like, steps towards changes and changes that have been at the forefront of 2020. And there's been so many conversations about, accessibility to the arts and who is shown in museums, but also who works in museums. And I benefit from, privileges of class and I think colorism and education, which allow me to navigate those spaces. Yeah, when installing, like, most of the only Black people I interacted with were security guards. I don't know if, there's more BIPOCs in the staff, but that was like my interaction during that time. I don't think it's to say something about that specific museum, but I think in general it's just a thing across the board that BIPOCs are usually working in jobs of service, or kind of, let's say, starter jobs, or, at the bottom of a pyramid when we have institutions that have that kind of format. And that brings complicated and I think, mixed feelings. And the other day I went back to the museum to fix some soil that had been broken on the floor. And so I was just busy looking at my things, and then the security guard there, who was this young Black man, came up to me and he was like, "Oh, I noticed there's bits and pieces that are broken. There's more here." And I was like, "Oh, thanks." And I kept fixing things around and looking at my show. And then he came back towards me and he's like, "Oh, do you know if only one person did all the work that's in this room?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, actually I did." And he just said, "Oh, it's magnificent," and then left. And I was really emotional at that time. So I wasn't even unable to respond and ask him anything about him, but I was so deeply touched because it felt like there was really a return between, intentions in making, where I'm thinking of, my brothers, my beautiful brothers who are in one of the performance videos, who I see as kind of the next generation, and thinking of, do those gestures that we enact can help the next generations to live in societies that have a little bit less burden? These people and these young Black men or women or non-binary people can be themselves more and accomplish more, and not just always, be fighting to be recognized or to exist or to get into space, but can then fully be themselves in all their complexity, and all their flaws and all their beauty. And so it was really interesting to have, or touching, I would say, to have this really simple, beautiful, and genuine and generous compliment from someone who's there, present in this space in its function as a worker of the museum, and not as someone who came to view it as, a leisure, or for whatever reason we go to the museum, and then have all those barriers break. Because I think as security guards, often your function a kind of silencing of your voice, in a sense. You're supposed to be there as a guard, but you're not interacting, you're not doing mediation with the public, and why not start doing these things, and why not shake it up? And you're there all day, You see the show more than most people. It really looped back to me, and it felt very charged and very meaningful. The future for me is a little bit uncertain. Things move and shift, and I think flexibility is what we've all had to learn how to develop in the past year. But actually, next month I'm having a solo show at Franz Kaka Gallery in Toronto, which I'm excited about. So that will be on in April, May. One thing I'm really looking forward to is a collaboration I'm doing with British artist Emi Alrai. We're gonna have that show at the Visual Arts Centre in Clarington, curated by Matt Kiba. I'm also gonna take part in the Momenta Festival in Montreal. It's this photo festival or image festival, let's say, that sprawls throughout the entire city, and it's a really good occasion to discover so many brilliant artists, local and international. So I'm very excited to take part in that. I will be doing work that centers on the notion of roses, or not the notion, but the object of roses. And yeah, I'm really geeking out hard on that at the moment. And yeah, I'm trying to just be flexible and do things a little bit more slowly this year. I think will be very enjoyable and much needed. And thank you so much for having me and listening and giving me space. And good luck in all your endeavors.